Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dow, the opinion page editor. President Trump likes picking fights. Some of his most consistent adversaries are elite universities and their leaders. And the feeling seems mutual. Countless university scholars have come out against recent demands and proposals by the federal government, such as Trump's so-called Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education. Critics of that compact say it amounts to extortion, federal overreach, that it would undermine First Amendment rights. But one scholar who is with me today says, not so fast. Danielle Allen is a political scientist at Harvard University. While she doesn't agree with Trump's finer points, she says the larger idea behind his compact is a good starting place. American universities need a fresh relationship with the government, she says. And through that process, perhaps we can take some lessons on how to improve our democracy. Danielle is also the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard. Welcome, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Jim. Glad to be here.
Danielle, according to polls, trust in universities has fallen significantly over the last decade. This is driven by high costs, doubts about how well colleges are preparing young people for the workforce, and also questions about ideological bias. How would you characterize the current relationship between universities and the U.S. public?
Well, what else has fallen actually in the last decade is the percentage of students who are enrolling from college after high school. It's really quite astonishing, but across the country, we've declined about 10 percentage points in terms of college going for high school graduates. So the crisis of confidence, the crisis of legitimacy is having really impactful consequences for the country. The level of education of a population matters for the health of its economy, for the vibrancy of its cultural life, for the soundness of its politics. So I think it's an important issue.
Yeah. You've spoken about the importance of society having some sort of compact with its higher education institutions. Could you talk about that idea a little bit? What do you mean by that? And what is that compact today? How would you describe it?
The idea that higher education institutions should have a compact with society is actually an old idea. It goes back to the period immediately after World War II, when the president asked an MIT scientist, Vannevar Bush, to consider how the country could make effective and valuable investments in science. And so he offered a proposal that involved federal funding for the research enterprise and the idea that universities would really support the country's forward movement in areas of economics, technology, national security, and things like that. And so it's not that anybody sort of formally said, okay, yes, this is a compact or a contract, but that was sort of the implicit idea that universities can operate in the public good and the federal government sort of invests in those public good functions.
And has it been changing or just falling apart? Where is it now today, that compact?
Well, I think from the statistics that you started with, it's pretty clear that there is a crisis of confidence within the American public in higher education. That crisis of confidence has a lot of dimensions. There are the problems of cost and the just expense of going to college. Right. There are the questions of whether or not, as a matter of private good, people get a return on investment for that cost. There are the questions about ideological conformity or quote-unquote wokeness on college campuses and whether or not we are succeeding at cultivating a kind of culture of debate and broad openness to different viewpoints so that people can learn across those divides of perspective. So, all of those elements of the crisis of confidence don't actually have much to do with the themes of science and investment in science that were at the core of the social contract. So we've had this sort of difficult situation where there's been a crisis of confidence. That crisis of confidence hasn't really been about the scientific enterprise, but then the scientific enterprise is what has been sort of penalized because of that crisis of confidence.
So how would you want to see the compact change? What would a new, more vibrant or modern compact look like?
Well, for one thing, I do think it's important for the institutions of higher education to step up to their responsibilities in preparing people for citizenship and civic participation. At the end of the day, that is one of the core functions of all of our universities, and it's not a function that we've taken seriously. Many decades ago, we thought it was important that students learn things like the Constitution and the philosophical foundations of democracy, that they have the chance to think about how that has changed over time. What are the pressures? What are the failure points? Where could we make improvements? But you might call that a science of democracy. And we basically don't teach that science of democracy any longer. That's a real gap. And I do think as we think about the relationship of higher ed to society, that's a responsibility that we have, is to sort of maintain that science of democracy over time, make sure it's passed from one generation to the next.
I think you've also spoken a bit about the importance of elite universities, perhaps in particular, admitting larger student bodies, bringing down their costs.
Yeah.
Do you think your university, Harvard University, is taking steps in that direction?
Well, let me just speak more broadly about universities, and in particular, maybe about sort of Ivy League universities as a sort of set. Some have grown and some haven't, is the short of it. And I do think in a country that's growing, in a context where a seat in one of our most distinguished universities is life-changing. Those who are gatekeepers for opportunity have a responsibility to keep the gate growing in the size of the population. So from my point of view, there is a pretty strong moral imperative to figure out a pathway to growth.
So the Trump administration's education department presented its own ideas for a new compact. Can you talk about what they proposed?
Sure. So, and here I will say too, I mean, I wrote a piece about the compact, as I'm sure you saw, and it, had the headline of, why I'm excited about Trump's compact for higher education, which made all of my colleagues' hair sort of stand on end with horror. And the first sentence of my column was that, no, I don't think anybody should sign it. Right. And there's an important distinction in that. The reason I was excited about the compact is because I do think that universities and colleges need to reconceive their connection to the American people. And what I had seen for the 6 or 9 months of the sort of, call it, attack of the Trump administration on higher ed is that colleges and universities were not actually coordinating with each other. Each was involved in a kind of bilateral conversation with the administration. Right. And so the compact suddenly produced this opportunity where people could talk to each other. You knew that 9 institutions had all gotten the same letter. Right. Nobody had to worry about disclosing confidential information. Right. So that's why it was exciting. Yeah. And just the idea that they could actually step into that space and tackle some of the hard questions that we've all known have been on the table for years. Right. Right. The cost of tuition has been on the table for years as a problem.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about what was actually in that proposed compact that I think nobody signed?
Sure. Well, let me start with the problematic pieces. I mean, there were parts of the compact that were really about control of the intellectual activities of a university. And no university can sign on to something like that. There were First Amendment violations and institutional autonomy violations and so forth. Right. On the sort of productive side, though, they also were naming issues around viewpoint diversity on campuses and whether or not it's possible to cultivate cultures of debate where people can express quite divergent ideological perspectives and have a productive conversation in that context. They named commitments to non-discrimination. Right. So some of the problems that they named and even some of the sort of principles that they articulated for helping move out of those problems were completely reasonable and certainly merit conversation.
I know that the administration's response generally to these types of things is that, well, the real problem there's a lack of ideological diversity in universities. Is there some truth to that, do you think, or is that a ridiculous oversimplification of what's going on?
So, 8 years ago, I and others, my colleagues, Archon Fung, Meredith Wienik, co-chaired a task force at Harvard, a task force on inclusion and belonging. Right. And we were quite intentional about thinking about viewpoint at that point in time because, yes, in our polling and elsewhere on campus, we were finding that conservative students were expressing a sense of silencing in the classroom and on campus and the like. In truth, I think the spread of opinion on campus is wider than people think it is. I'm sure it could be wider. The real problem is that we don't have a culture of debate.
And what do you mean by that exactly? Just that people don't know how to do it or that they feel anxious or
All of the
that it's
above.
risky?
All of the above. There sort of isn't really an expectation that the life of the mind, which we cultivate on the campus, is about ensuring that positions, that are really across a spectrum are being brought together into conversation and encountering one another. And so people have less practice at doing that. They feel uncomfortable. It produces anxiety and discomfort. And so I suppose what I'm trying to communicate is that my sort of consistent experience has been that the spread of opinion among my students was wider than you might have thought, or than you could sometimes tell from the way people engaged in class. And it took, really proactive effort to sort of bring out all the voices from different parts of the spectrum.
You focus your research on democracy, I think. I think it's fair to say, right?
Yep. Very fair. That's all. I'm like a one-note Nelly. It's just only about democracy. So
bring these two strands together. Do you see universities as being a good microcosm for studying the way democracy works, civic debate, and those sorts of things?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And, unfortunately, that's the kind of question I could talk for 2 hours about. So you're going to have to rein me in. Universities matter for democracy on at least 2 dimensions. They matter as among the anchor institutions of civil society. So in other words, they are actually part of our whole apparatus of democracy. We've got Congress, and we've got the White House, and we've got state houses all over the country and the like, and we have universities. And we should think of them as part of that just kind of basic skeletal structure of a democracy. Then secondly, I think as you were suggesting, universities themselves internally absolutely exhibit some of the key principles of democracy, which is to say frank speech, debate, using debate to try to pursue the right answer. Of course, our goal inside a university is what would be scientifically evaluated as the right answer. It's not just a majority vote outcome. That is a decisive difference between universities and democracies.
More of my conversation with Danielle Allen after a short break. Danielle, you come from a long line of political activists. Can you talk about how your family history has inspired your interest and passion for democracy reform?
Sure. My granddad, who helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida, he did that in the 40s, which was an exceptionally dangerous time. Lynchings were on the rise. Yep. My great-granddad marched with suffragists on Boston Common in 1917. Wow. We forget actually how dangerous that time was. In D.C. in that year, President Wilson, had called the military into the streets of D.C. To suppress the protests from suffragettes. People were being jailed. Women were being held in really terrible conditions, going on hunger strikes and then being force-fed and so forth. So the point of that is just to say, their experiences put things in perspective for me. Right. We are living in a time of great challenge, for sure. And many people are really facing violence and extreme vulnerability. And I also recognize some, the important distances that we have traveled in this country. And so I take inspiration from that, and also a sort of sense of resoluteness. So I did sort of grow up in a super civically engaged family and did learn that passion for democracy from them.
Yeah. So it was around the dinner table and Thanksgiving dinners and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I mean, my dad grew up as northern Florida, and he had 11 brothers and sisters, and half of them moved to California. So growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was a big extended family network, and people were engaged across the political spectrum. Wow. So I often tell a story of my aunt and my dad both running for political office in the same year. 92, my aunt was on the ballot in the Bay Area for the Peace and Freedom Party, far left side of the political spectrum. And my dad was running for U.S. Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican.
Oh,
so we had incredible dinner table conversations. Yeah, they just would go at it, like back and forth, hammer and tongs. Yeah. But they never broke the bonds of love. It was always very clear. I mean, they just disagreed so intensely. Right. But it was clear they would always be there for each other. They would always have each other's back, and they always were.
Well, speaking about your dad and as a Reagan Republican, I think it was in the Atlantic magazine, you wrote last year about showing up at Princeton as a freshman, maybe 1989 or 1990, somewhere
Yep,
in there.
1989. Yeah.
And you called yourself a committed conservative.
I was then. Yep.
You tell an interesting anecdote about crossing paths with Cornell West on campus. Talk about what happened. That's an interesting anecdote.
So that time on college campuses was not unlike this time, right? There were lots of debates about political correctness, sort of PC culture instead of woke culture. The vocabulary has changed, but the debate is the same. I was a sometimes writer for the student paper. There were a set of Black fraternities and sororities on campus, and they had decided to use as an initiation rite that they would sort of everybody would dress all in black, walk in a straight line, and not talk to any white people. I wrote a piece in the student paper making the case I thought this wasn't a productive initiation rite, and that produced a lot of blowback from all kinds of different students on campus and bullying treatment of various kinds, shouting at me, got spat on one occasion, and was really pushed into a sort of kind of isolation on campus. I was in my dorm room one day, by myself, feeling sorry for myself and so forth. And the phone rang and the voice on the other end said, "Is that Sister Danielle? This is Brother West. I want you to come in and see me." And so Professor Cornell West asked me to come to his office, and he had heard about what was going on, and he wanted to both understand, me and my perspective, what had I written, and why. He wanted to support me in developing my thoughts and ideas, and invited me to come visit with him once a week to talk about whatever I was reading and thinking about. He engaged with the other kids on campus too, some of those kids who had been going at me and the like. And by the end of the year, when it was sort of the year of the Rodney King assaults and then the terrible conflagration in Los Angeles, we had rallies on campus. And thanks to him and all the work that he did as a teacher with kids on both sides of the political spectrum, right? Me and then the other kids as well. We were all on the same stage together for the rally and all, sharing our different perspectives, but responding to the events of the moment. And so that moment of teaching, as you can tell, changed my life, has stayed with me forever, and is for me the sort of model of what good teaching should do.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, so you've obviously been eating, drinking, breathing, talking about democracy since you were a kid, it seems like almost, and obviously right through college. But was there some moment in your young life where you said, "Okay, I'm going to make democracy my thing"?
Well, I think there are really two moments. One where it became my scholarly subject, and then another moment where it became my practical project. The first was when I was a sophomore in college, and for no reason that I can remember, I wandered into a course on ancient Athenian democracy. And in this class, we were reading law court speeches, prosecutions and defenses from ancient Athens. And something was really bugging me about these all semester long. And it wasn't until about halfway through the semester, which I know when it was because the windows were finally open in the classroom and, winter had receded and we were getting sort of spring air finally. And I raised my hand and said, "Professor, did the Athenians not have prisons?" And his answer was, "That would be a great dissertation topic." But it was just this sort of moment of suddenly realizing that the world could be completely different than the one I knew. I'd grown up in Southern California. Prisons were growing around me all the time. And that's what had been bugging me in these texts. You had all these prosecutions and defenses. They kept talking about punishment, and nobody mentioned prisons. So that took me into studying ancient Athens more to try to understand this alternative place. And that was really what sort of got me into the sort of scholarly study of democracy.
Yeah.
For the democracy as a project part, that's more of a story about just how life unfolds. And I described how I had inherited a kind of conviction and belief in democracy from my family. Then as I watched my own generation come up in the world, I saw we had these totally divergent life paths. I've had great opportunities, and at the same time, I have cousins who are not with us any longer. So kids I used to run around in the streets playing football with, who because of addiction, substance use disorder, or gun violence or incarceration are gone. And it was at the point I lost my youngest cousin, Michael, in 2009, that I was just like, wait a second, this whole democracy thing, it's not just supposed to be abstractly valuable.
Right.
It is supposed to give us a society that makes it possible for every generation to do better than the previous.
Right.
And what's really important for me as well is for every generational cohort to be able to come up together and not have this kind of pulling apart that my family was experiencing.
Well, so I think a lot of Americans today, people who don't study democracy, maybe don't know the founding documents or the founding fathers, are concerned about the state of democracy right now.
Yeah.
How do you think about the problem as someone who studies it constantly and thinks about it constantly? What in your mind are the greatest dangers to democracy in this moment?
Well, I think, it's just been the 250th anniversary of the publication of Tom Paine's Common Sense. I think you can go back to common sense, and the answers are all right there. The case that Paine makes is that freedom, the ability for people to steer their own lives and have a sort of stability of context so that they can steer their lives, depends on government flowing from the people and being for the people. And the only way you get that is through legislatures.
Yeah.
It's this, we've gotten in the habit in this country of thinking of the president as the end all and be all of our politics. But in truth, the project of freedom is to have a legislature that can give voice to the people's will, generate some kind of always imperfect synthesis, but nonetheless something that comes from the people, and then with an executive who will actually execute that. Our Constitution is out of balance. It's been growing over the course of the 20th century, but the executive has overwhelmed the legislative branch. And so now we all live with this sort of sense of arbitrary whiplash, that feeling of like this changes, that changes, and so forth. They can't count on anything. And there's sort of breaking of various kinds of constitutional provisions and the like. I mean, that is what unfreedom feels like.
Yeah.
Not in its worst form, but certainly it's in the direction that it's heading.
Right. So our system of checks and balances effectively has been undermined and maybe doesn't even exist or barely exists anymore.
It's hanging on.
It's hanging by a thread. What do you think needs to be done to reinvigorate checks and balances in America today? And sort of related to that, I'm curious about your thoughts about whether this problem of a growingly a more powerful executive and a less powerful legislature or Congress predates President Trump.
Oh, it certainly does predate him. I mean, this growth has been in progress for the whole of the 20th century. So President Roosevelt, during World War II, certainly expanded the powers and prerogatives of the executive, and that the growth has been constant. There were expansions under President Obama, under President Biden, but President Trump has brought a maximalist version of that expansion to the table.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of dimensions of restoring legislative supremacy, the idea that, again, the legislature is actually the driving force. For me, I mean, I'm sure one of the things I'm working on is a ballot initiative here in Massachusetts to get rid of party primaries and replace them with an all-party primary where all candidates from all parties can run on the same first ballot, and then the top two go forward to the general election.
Right.
So a lot like, say, the Boston mayor's race, but with party labels. And the reason to do that is because then, in order to win, candidates have to build a 50% coalition. That puts the power in the hands of the people, as opposed to making the sort of elected officials just sort of dependent on the party structures. If you watch the Congress right now, the Republicans are all dependent on the president because of how the primary structure operates.
Right. So you have this project now called The Renovator, which is essentially a Substack, I guess. You've collected people like yourself, experts in political science and democracy in particular, and you're all sharing your ideas about how to renovate it, in effect. So one of the concepts you talked about in one of your pieces there was the difference between opposition and resistance, which I thought was really interesting. Could you flesh that out for us?
Sure. I mean, I have to give this some context because as a scholar of democracy, I've spent the last few years in the 18th century, okay? So I have a book coming out in June that's a biography of an 18th century British politician.
Really?
He was Thomas Paine's first political patron.
I see.
The reason this is so fascinating is because they had the same problem in Britain as the colonists had in America. That is to say, they were both fed up with George III, okay? And in Britain, they ultimately solved that problem without a revolution. So consider King Charles now compared to our president. Which is more checked, right, or restrained? So the British actually have succeeded in securing legislative or parliamentary supremacy. So the point is just that the 18th century actually gives us an interesting case for thinking about some of the problems that we currently are facing.
Wow.
And in that moment, in the 1760s and 1770s, when they had to figure out what to do about King George, they built an opposition and for the first time really invented the idea of opposition politics, where people are proactively cultivating an alternative governance agenda. And so that was the distinction I really wanted to make. We talk a lot about resistance, and resistance is all about stopping something, sort of shifting attention, blocking roads, impeding the unjust activities of governmental officials and so forth. But opposition is about proactive, alternative approach to governance and finding the pathways available for articulating that and actually moving it forward. So trying to make space for people to kind of imagine occupying that kind of idea of being a loyal opposition.
Danielle Allen is the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard. Danielle, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jim. It was fun.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave a review. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jim Dow. Thanks for listening.